right, welcome back for another special episode of the Daily Wrestling News Show, where we are here to teach, learn, and remember the history of professional wrestling in 5 to 10 minutes a day. And John, this is a special, so we'll be going a little bit more than 5 or 10 minutes today.
Yep. We managed to talk for almost a half hour last week, but not sure we'll go that long, but whatever flows.
It was funny last week, we were talking about a show that is realistically, by the time you subtract commercials out, was probably about 40 minutes.
Right.
And we went just about 40 minutes talking about Memphis last week. So
it was that good.
Yep. But last night, Tales from the Territory episode number 2 continued. This time it was Andy Kaufman versus the King of Memphis. Of course, Jerry Lawler is who they're referring to. Again, Tales from the Territory is by Vice TV and $7 Production, in association with the creators of Dark Side of the Ring, Jason Eisner and Evan Husney. So, executive producer is The Rock. So, of course, it's good stuff. And John, last week you and I talked. It seemed like all we did was learn on the episode last week. We didn't know anything about the Memphis territory. Well, this week we're still in Memphis, but this is like the one thing that we knew something about, right?
Yeah, exactly. This was, if you asked me about the Memphis territory, I would tell you Jerry Lawler. If you asked me about any storyline in the history of wrestling of the Memphis territory, I would tell you Jerry Lawler, Andy Kaufman, and literally that would be where it ends.
Right. And so I think in general, I knew the story of what was going on. And I saw the movie ages ago. I didn't watch it before this episode, which would have been fun. But the Man on the Moon movie that Lawler and Letterman and everybody was in, and Jim Carrey played Andy Kaufman. I saw that ages ago, but so I knew the story pretty much. I haven't read Jerry Lawler's book. Have you read that by chance?
No, I have not.
Yeah, so I think he detailed a lot of this stuff in there, but yeah, I hadn't had a chance to read that, but so anyway, like we said before, this episode centered around Continental Wrestling Association, which is apparently Memphis. Their biggest feud ever: Jerry the King Lawler versus Hollywood's Andy Kaufman. The panel was the same as last week. It was Jerry Lawler, Jimmy Hart, Jeff Jarrett, Jerry Jarrett, and Dutch Mantell. And they kick off the episode talking about the Mid-South Coliseum. And just a small kind of like throwaway point, but 10,000 people each Monday they had to draw to that Mid-South Coliseum. And we talked briefly about it last week, John, how they're bringing the same fans back to the same building week after week is not something that anybody could do today.
Yeah, and every day, and I didn't realize that they. I wasn't 100% sure about the way they talked about it. Saturday morning was the big show where 7 out of every 10 TVs in the territory were watching them, and they said that was a 90-minute commercial for what was going to go on Monday night.
Right.
Monday night was TV2, or Monday night was just get everybody in the building. I wasn't.
I don't really know, but I feel like they must have taped Monday night. If it wasn't on TV, I'm sure they taped it because that's when all the big angles and the big matches were. So
yeah. So they were filling that building twice a week, and when they had a good angle, which obviously this one, they were turning people away, knowing that they could get 10,000, maybe 10,500 people in the building, and they were turning people away for weeks.
Yeah. Everyone would come into Memphis to face Jerry Lawler, but when they got to this one, it was weird. It didn't start this way though. No. I mean, I guess overall, when you look at the entire episode, was there anything that you have the feud with what was her name, Foxy, and you had the feud with Jerry and the David Letterman show. Was there a portion of the episode that you found that you got the most out of, like that you learned the most?
Well, yeah, the part that I absolutely had no real background on, it's 1982. Okay, so I'm 8 years old, so I'm not really aware that all this stuff is going on. I knew that it happened later. I knew that I knew he was doing the intergender thing. What I didn't realize is that it was Kaufman's dream to be a wrestler. Like I thought maybe this was one of those things where, because he was so eclectic, he got bored with Hollywood and said, "Hey, let's try this." No, he grew up watching Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, knew that the man in front of him was trying to make the people hate him, and he still loved him anyway, did Kaufman. And it was his dream to do this, to be a heel wrestler. And in pursuit of that dream, he was doing this. He was doing that whole intergender, offer $1,000 to any woman who could come up to the stage and try and beat him. He was doing this on Mike Douglas, Merv Griffin, and at stand-up, arena, like wherever he would normally go and ply his trade as a stand-up comic, he was doing this wrestling gimmick, and it became his passion. The way that this all happened, this part I had no idea. Maybe it was in the movie. Probably was in the movie, but like you said, I watched it when it first came out or first came to DVD, whatever, and haven't watched it since.
Yeah.
He approached Vince Jr. with this. Vince Sr., excuse me. Vince Jr. would have jumped out of his skin for it. Vince Sr. said, maybe bringing a guy in from Hollywood's going to make everyone think, or make people think directors, so I don't want to do it. And all Kaufman wanted to do was to finally do this gimmick that he had been doing on the comedy circuit and on, TV late night shows. He wanted to do it in front of wrestling fans to get that feedback of the heel.
Yeah.
And that was the part I had. That was one of the two big things I had no idea about and was just like amazed, really.
Yeah, I thought it was great. And Jerry Lawler is kind of recounting this whole thing for us when you watch the Tales show. And he talks about how, what you mentioned, the Buddy Rogers stuff, and how when Andy was doing stand-up, before he got famous, he would try to make the audience uncomfortable. He wouldn't go so far as to try to make them dislike him, but he would try to make them uncomfortable with him. And so, like you mentioned, he pitches his whole shtick to Vince McMahon, and Vince McMahon turns him down. But it's Bill Apter who is there. Who Bill Apter's, famous publisher and writer for the wrestling magazines. He's there, and he gives Kaufman Jerry Jarrett's phone number and says, "These guys draw big crowds down in Memphis. You should call them. They will be interested in hearing you out." And so Jerry Jarrett he picks up the phone, he talks to him, he's like, "I don't know. Am I being pranked here? Is this even Andy Kaufman?" And so it's kind of classic, I thought, to kind of show you the relationship with these individuals. He pawns Kaufman off on the King and says, "Talk to the King." So the King is out to suss out whether or not that Kaufman is legit. And Jerry brings them, they agree, bring him right in. And the thing that was interesting to me that I don't think I knew this beforehand is that all these women that he would bring up at these shows, live shows, and then also at wrestling shows, the first couple of weeks that he was in Memphis, he knew 10 different women. They were just randomly picked from the crowd. They were shoot fights, so to speak.
Yeah, that was the other thing that blew me away, was that he had done all he had done on the comedy circuit and the late night circuit, and then he goes down to Memphis, and for the he's almost a month into his wrestling career, and so far everything's legit. Nothing's prearranged, and he doesn't have any training, and they don't know who he's pulling out of the crowd, and he's wrestling 5 women a night. And it's just, that's astonishing. It's not until after he beats all 5 women the first time. Second time around, as you mentioned earlier, this Foxy manhandles him a little bit because she's a larger gal, but she gets all blowed up, as they say these days. She loses her wind, and he eventually is able to pin her. And that's when Lawler steps in. Like, Lawler knows he's got a money draw here.
Yeah.
That's when he steps in and goes, I think he said he cut a promo saying like, I think I can give her a couple of tips and then she'll beat him. At this point, there's still no plan for Andy to ever wrestle a male or and by extension a professional wrestler. So it's just they're a month into his career, bringing him down to Memphis and drawing and selling out the building, which I guess they kind of were already doing anyway. But he's an added buzz.
Yeah,
and there's not a bit of planning in any of it, which is astonishing for a professional wrestler.
And what's amazing is Kaufman is just so happy to live out this dream, right? He does the 5 women the first week, and he goes to the back and he's like, "How was it?" And they're like, "Oh my god, it was great." And they're thinking, we just need to pull more money out of this situation. We got to do a return." And so he says, "You got to come back next week." Jerry King Lawler says this to Kaufman, "You got to come back next week." And Kaufman's response is, "Really? I get to come back?" so, so, so Kaufman is living out his dream, and the two Jerrys, the King and Jarrett, are like, "Okay, back the money truck up. We'll as much as we can, and keep on coming back." So like you mentioned, he beats 5 women the first week. He beats 4 women handily the second week, which, by the way, if he's just randomly picking them out of the crowd, why does he pick the big ones? Like, give yourself a break and pick, but he does pick this Foxy who's on the bigger side, and it builds to the rematch. And they do the rematch, and it's funny, there's this whole thing that Kaufman says, if Foxy can beat me, she can marry me. and she says on the slide to Jerry Lawler, "I wouldn't marry Andy Kaufman if he was the last man on earth." And it's funny, because and then she's talking to Dutch Mantel and asking for advice, and Dutch is like, just, if I were you, I'd try to, take him early. And she does in the early part of the match. She takes the advantage. But like you mentioned, she eventually blows up in this match as well, and Kaufman gets the pin. But Kaufman abused her towards the back end of the match. He was like rubbing her face in the mat and stuff. And that's when the Jerry Lawler stuff comes in, because she was Jerry's protege, for lack of a better word, right? She's the one who was he was the one who said, if I give her a few tips, she ought to be able to beat Kaufman, no problem. And so he has to come in to defend her a little bit. And he just gives Kaufman a little shove.
Right.
Nothing serious. No big deal, just a little shove. But Kaufman sells it like he's been, punched directly in the face for a shoot. And when he goes down, and it's the whole, "You can't hit me. I'm from Hollywood. I'll sue you, and I'll sue you, and you, and you." It's like Anna Jay with "I'll choke you, I'll choke you, I'll choke you." He's suing everybody. And that starts the big Kaufman Lawler program. They get to the back and they start developing a program. So, and then, John, what did you think of the actual match? Because I have some thoughts. April 5th, 1982 is the match that we build to. It's Kaufman and Lawler. Now, in the show, we didn't get to see the full match or anything like that, but I think we essentially did. So, just your thoughts on what we saw.
It's what amazed me the most about the actual in-ring action is that, in today's day and age, if you're an outsider and you're being brought into the wrestling business, if Vince is the one bringing you and you go down to the PC, you could work out there for months to get ready.
Like Bad Bunny.
Yeah, exactly. If you're anywhere else in the country, everyone's got some kind of training area with a ring set up and whatnot. Not only did they not have that, they couldn't even go down to the Coliseum because this is ironclad kayfabe.
Oh, yeah.
No one could know what was going on. The match was worked through in Jerry's good buddy, who would serve as the referee's living room. Yeah. They bring Kaufman back down to Memphis. They meet, clandestine in this guy's living room. And Jerry's taking him through the lift for the suplex and what it's going to be like for the pile driver. And so the thing that stood out the most to me was when we get to the match, which, wasn't going to knock your socks off. that is the first time Andy Kaufman is really taking bumps, and he's taking them from a professional. And, a suplex, I'm sure, is no fun. I've taken a few of them into the pool with,
Sure.
buddies and my brother and whatnot as a kid. I've never slapped the mat with my back. And a pile driver can't be any fun at all. And he takes two big ones.
Yeah.
And it impressed the hell out of me that something didn't go bad.
Well, I'll tell you what. The first thing I noticed was he does what a lot of modern heels do. First, the bell rings, he rolls out. He rolls out and he's, taunting the crowd and taunting the opponent or whatever. And so the whole match is really only 3 moves: headlock, suplex, pile driver. And Jerry only gets Kaufman back in the ring because he's going to give Kaufman the headlock.
Right.
And what I thought was what I thought was really cool with this headlock is to watch Jerry work, because he gets in the headlock and it's you kind of know the situation, and he is using his hands to motion to the crowd, like, just give me one more second. We're gonna lull this guy into a false sense of security. And then Lawler picks him up and does this belly to back suplex, which, by the way, I hear you. I thought Kaufman might die right there. I couldn't see that.
Like Jerry said, he folded in half.
High angle.
He took that bump.
Yes. Super high angle. It looked nasty, gnarly. And man, and then the pile driver, which I guess I never really knew what the finish to this match was. I knew that, Kaufman would wear a neck brace, forever after this, but I didn't realize that, the pile driver was, outlawed by the athletic commission, and it was a DQ. And then all the adulation from the fans, and Lawler's like, what am I gonna, I guess I'll give him another one. Gives him another one. And then, last week we talked about Memphis and their commitment to keeping it real. And it struck me when you hear the whole Andy Kaufman thing. What we know about Andy Kaufman is that he kind of lived he lived the character, whether, and he would never come out of character. And here you have this guy who takes these 2 pile drivers, and he is selling it for everything he's worth. He refuses to get up. He says, you're going to have to bring me an ambulance. And the referee goes to Jerry and says, he says he needs an ambulance. And Jerry's like, it costs $300. I don't want to do an ambulance job here. Kaufman will pay for it. He's like, bring the ambulance. So Kaufman sells for like 30 minutes while the ambulance comes, which also says to me 2 things. First of all, they should have had an ambulance on hand in case something went wrong, I think. But this was the territory days, and didn't have that kind of thing. But for 30 minutes, and if you think like laying in the middle of the ring with 10,000 of your closest enemies around you is bad enough, he would then go to the hospital and sell it for 3 days, working the doctors, working the nurses, and they got a ton of publicity. Jimmy Hart was talking about all the TV stations that were covering this and stuff. So yeah, I mean, we know that's true, right? That we know that's why, this is such a big angle in wrestling history, is that all the publicity that was worked off it. But it was 3 moves and one of the biggest matches really in the history of wrestling, especially one of the biggest matches to ever happen on a non-national platform.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things that, again, before I even knew what the territories were, and when the only wrestling I knew was Vince's product that I which wasn't necessarily on constantly, and certainly not multiple times a week like it is now. Somehow I still knew that this moment existed.
Yeah.
And it's just been part of pop culture for essentially most of my lifetime. And yet, they don't, he goes to the hospital, and they say he's there for 3 days. But what they don't hammer on until later in the episode is that he never, like you said, he never stopped selling in the hospital. He was working the doctors.
Yeah.
He wasn't talking to anyone. Lawler didn't hear from him for a week. Jerry Jarrett didn't hear from him for a week. Jerry Jarrett actually started to get nervous because he
Yes.
wasn't hearing anything. He was worried, that the next thing he was going to hear was from a lawyer or something. And,
Yeah.
meanwhile, it's making national news. And he's in the hospital, and he's not just in the hospital for a couple of, to catch a couple of promotional, like he's there as if he's a patient. He's in traction for part of it. This man was he was the spirit of everything wrestling in that era should have been, just in the body of a 145-pound man, soaking wet with rocks in his pockets.
Okay, so 30 minutes in the middle of the ring selling. That's pretty great. 3 days in the hospital. That's going above and beyond. This man wouldn't take the neck brace off afterwards, though. Like he was continuing to keep kayfabe, and it took Taxi, the hit show that he was on. It was like the number one show in the country.
Yes.
It took them saying, "Listen, if you don't take that thing off, we're going to have to write you off the show." That's what it took to get that neck brace off of Andy Kaufman. And Lawler was telling more stories on this, and he talked about how Kaufman would tell him that Tony Danza was pissed. And Tony Danza apparently had a little bit of a boxing background, and he wanted to come to Memphis and back up Kaufman, and Kaufman's like, I don't really want to smarten him up. and Jerry's like, well, then if you don't smarten him up and he comes down here, we're the only thing we're gonna have to hurt him.
Yeah.
So Kaufman's like, well, let's not do that then.
Yeah, probably not the best thing.
And okay, so we've talked about the him getting into the business, and we talked about the big match, April 5th, 1982. I think the other thing that there was heavily focused on in this show, and the other thing that really makes this angle famous is that David Letterman show.
Yes.
And I don't know which one is, cart, horse, chicken, egg. I don't know which one actually made the whole angle famous, if it was the Letterman show or if it was just, Kaufman going there. They obviously both got national publicity, but Kaufman just calls Lawler and says, would you like to be on the Letterman show? And Jerry's like, without blinking, of course.
Let me think about it. Yes.
And it's Kaufman's idea that Lawler takes a swipe at him. But Lawler says, I can't do that. They're going to arrest me if I do that.
Well, and besides the fact, Lawler's thought, and it was, you would think that he would have been 100% right. The show's taped at, most of it, nowadays they tape it at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't know what time it was back then, but they tape it and edit it down. He said, they won't put it on air.
Right.
I'll get arrested, and it's not going to make air anyway. So, that's probably not a good idea.
And I think, he didn't really say it, but what I kind of gathered was he was feeling like the show just was boring or something.
Yeah,
like that nothing was happening.
Yeah.
So toward the end of the segment, Lawler just gets up and smacks the shit out of him, really. And then the whole thing, they take him to the back, to the green room, which he says is usually buzzing, but now there's nobody there. And 10 minutes goes by. He says usually during, this kind of thing, they take a 2-minute break between segments or whatever, and they're right back at it. They took 10 minutes. So this was, they were really trying to figure things out. Then they bring Lawler back out. And at this point, Lawler's sitting down when they come back from commercial, and Kaufman is off stage. And Letterman turns to Andy and says, Andy, are you going to come in here for this? And Kaufman comes in, and he comes in I guess the word was a tirade of offensive language at his disposal, slinging all that stuff. And he threw water at Jerry, and it made for great TV.
And yeah, and I guess the thing that I didn't know, once again, this is one of those things that when it happened, I wasn't a watcher of late night. I was, I wasn't 10 years old yet.
Right.
But I always kind of knew, once I knew who, when I got to high school, I guess I started to know who Letterman was, because he was kind of like, he was ECW. like
Yeah.
Leno, Johnny turning over to Leno was the WWF. That was the established thing. Letterman was the one that was coming up. And then by the time I was high school, it was like super cool to watch Letterman. When I got to college at Seton Hall, there were 3 different bootleg T-shirts with Letterman top 10 lists on them about stuff that just was inside jokes amongst the Seton Hall people, and like Letterman was cool.
Right.
But I knew that this existed, and what I didn't realize was this was Letterman's first season.
Yeah.
He was just getting his feet wet. He was just establishing what his show was going to be. And I guess that probably played into them saying, screw it. Let's leave as much of it in as possible. Essentially, all they did was bleep the blue streak of obscenity that Kaufman came at Lawler with, and they left the whole thing in. And Lawler talks about, nobody talked to him after it. Someone kind of hustled him to the elevator, because I guess they had a little bit of the Letterman show had a little bit of a relationship with Kaufman. And they knew, or at least this one particular producer or whatever, knew that he was a little bit off his rocker. And he says to Lawler, he may wind up calling the cops on you.
Right.
You may get arrested here. So I'm going to take you right to, I don't know if it was a private elevator or whatever. I'm going to take you to the elevator that we're going to take you right down the street, put you in a cab, or I think he walked across the street to his hotel or whatever. But we're going to get you out of the building so this doesn't get worse. And Lawler's in his hotel room, no contact with anyone, no idea how this is going to play out. And he turns on his TV at 11:30 that night, or whenever, or maybe it was midnight when Letterman was airing at the time, and sees all of it.
Yeah.
And he's blown away.
And Jeff Jarrett's like, oh my God, this is real. So Jeff would have been pretty young at the time, but Jeff Jarrett's watching at home and he's like, oh my God, this angle is real. So another thing that struck me is, and it's kind of a parallel to something we talked about last week. Last week we talked about the symphony and how when they came up out of the symphony was playing, and then they would bring the ring up, and the fans didn't really know what to make of it, and eventually they got the fans kind of involved, and they became a good crowd for the match. This week, Jerry Lawler talks about the going back during the break after the slap. And when he comes back out, he says they have transformed into a wrestling crowd now. he got all the boos and all that stuff. Which another thing that was funny is this whole Heart Foundation dynamic, right? Because if you were to take that same show, put it down in Memphis, Jerry Lawler's not getting booed there. But New York, I presume, is where the Letterman show was. You put that show in New York, and Kaufman is the babyface. So it's hard. How would Kaufman ever come off as a babyface?
Well, I'm sure most of New York didn't know who the hell Jerry Lawler was.
No, it was the King of Memphis.
Yeah, he's right there in front of him. So it was just amazing. And where I thought you were going with the parallel last week was, here we are again, the Memphis territory. That symphony match is in the Smithsonian.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's pretty big. This Letterman moment with a wrestler that most of the crowd didn't know, and a guy who, while he was on the #1 comedy on TV, there weren't a lot of Latka episodes. There weren't a lot of episodes where Latka was the main guy. He was just kind of there. He was the comic in a comedy show. He was the comic relief. So, but he wasn't terribly well known. He was on a big show, but he wasn't a major player. This moment on Letterman was listed on a top 100 TV moments of all time list. So once again, the Memphis territory making history in a big way. And again, it's Tennessee, Kentucky. This little thing, big impact.
And the other thing is, and I thought you were starting to go this way when something you were saying earlier is that it was Letterman's first season, and many years later, when they're filming the Man on the Moon movie, David Letterman actually says to Jerry the King Lawler that for years they called this the famous episode. And Jerry would say, what do you mean by that? And Letterman explained that they attributed their fame for the Letterman show to this episode. Like, this was the one that made them famous. So they called it the famous episode. I thought that was pretty cool credit.
Yeah. It put them on the map. It made, it was like the Attitude Era. It was the holy crap, did you hear what happened? Now we've got to tune in to see what kind of random crazy crap is going to happen again.
Yeah.
Like, that was the one that made people start paying attention to Letterman. Like, ooh, this guy's doing, he's not doing the buttoned up, the comedian comes out and does 5 minutes of his cleanest material in a shirt and tie. Crazy stuff's going on over here.
And, it's funny that you were mentioning, like, we're both, you grew up in New Jersey, I'm upstate New York, and we're both kind of isolated from this stuff that was going on in the territories outside of the WWF. And but when Jerry Lawler first showed up in WWF to do commentary and stuff around WrestleMania 10, everybody knew him. I knew him. I knew him, and I knew him, and I didn't watch that stuff. So it's like, but the fame that kind of came off of that, we all knew him. So leaving Letterman, they said Kaufman was now just part of the territory. He was there. They did all kinds. Jerry said they did every kind of return bout that you could think of. Kaufman put a $5,000 bounty on Lawler, anybody that could take him out, put him in the hospital. They did. Kaufman and Jimmy Hart did handicap matches. So they did everything they possibly could to get this as much money as they could out of the Cole Kaufman angles.
Yeah. They wrung that towel out until it was almost dry. And you know what? They may have come up with more if not for how Andy's life would turn.
Yeah, very sad. So Jimmy Hart takes Andy Kaufman after a number of shows, I guess, to the gates of Elvis's house. And this is pretty weird. But Andy Kaufman stands at the gates of Elvis's house, and he writes his name in chalk, and he meditates in front of Elvis's house. And I guess he was just a huge Elvis fan. A weird thing, but something he did. And Jimmy noticed that during one of these sessions that Andy had a bit of a cough, and he said, "Oh, it's probably because you keep coming down here from New York. The temperature was in the 30s. It's warmer down here, so it's probably just the change in temperature. You got a head cold or whatever." And then Kaufman's on the Jerry Lawler show, which who knew that existed?
And it was Sunday mornings, so now you've got a third television show in a week, all based around this tiny little wrestling territory.
Right. So they do a backstage interview type of thing with Kaufman, and Kaufman coughs during the interview, and he comes up to Jerry afterwards, which at this point, by the way, they are friends, and he says, I'm sorry I coughed during the interview. I was just diagnosed with lung cancer." So, wow, here he is. He's still showing up at all these wrestling events. He's got lung cancer. He dies at the age, I think they said 39?
36.
36. So he dies at the age of 36. I'm going to update that in my notes. But that's very tragic. And, they interview Lawler after Kaufman's death. And Lawler says, he basically keeps it kayfabe, and he's like, "I wish they wouldn't ask me about Andy Kaufman. I feel bad he's dead and everything, but when somebody dies, you should really ask people that like him about it." So they keep it kayfabe, and fast forward many years when they're filming that movie, Kaufman's parents hated Jerry for years, and they told him so. Not just his parents, the whole family, because Andy never smartened them up.
Never let his family in on any of it.
Yeah. So. Dutch Mantel would say that the Kaufman-Lawler angle was the greatest angle he ever saw, and he kept himself in the dark. They would talk about how Andy Kaufman kept wrestling real, which, like we mentioned before, was the formula for success for Memphis. He never cashed a single check from any of his wrestling work. So this truly was Kaufman living out his dream. And Jerry Lawler says Andy Kaufman should be in the WWE Hall of Fame.
Yes.
And he even cites Triple H as saying that Triple H apparently has said in the past that the business was changed by Kaufman. So, so apparently there's maybe a push. Maybe we'll see that happen pretty soon here.
That would be pretty awesome. I mean, you gotta start running out of celebrities to put in that celebrity wing at some point. And he's the who was it? Was it Jeff Jarrett that said? He basically put the E in. He's the one who allowed them to go from the F to the E because he made it entertainment, and it made it kind of cross over. WWF did the whole rock and wrestling thing, and that started their whole crossover. But this was before that.
Yeah.
So this was, and like I said in the beginning, and it tickles me to think, Vince Jr. was with the company for a long time.
Yeah.
Before buying his father out. And in fact, if I remember correctly, he bought his father out in 82, I believe.
Around that time, yeah.
So the idea that now he must not have been in the same room when Andy approached his dad, because knowing he was preparing to, take over the company, it must.
You would have wanted to sign him to a 5-year deal.
It's like, who knows if Vince Jr. would admit it, but when he found out about this, he must have punched a hole in the wall. The idea that his father passed on all this crossover exposure.
The sad thing though is, the big match was in 82. Andy was probably gone before Vince's really, Hulkamania took off, basically.
Yeah.
So very sad. Next week, we go to the AWA. So we're picking up and moving over to the middle of the country. And it looks like the panel consists of Ken Patera, Medusa, or Alundra Blaze, Diamond Dallas Page, Steve Olsonowski, who is Steve O, and I think Greg Gagne is in there. So that's going to be the panel for next week's episode. I'm pretty eager. I've heard a lot about AWA, but it's similar to Memphis. I really haven't watched any.
Yeah, when I think of AWA, and I'm not even 100% sure about what I'm about to say, in my mind, I remember reading some story in some magazine that my mother was probably pissed that I bought when I was in 5th grade because it had somebody with a bloody face on the cover or whatever. And I remember reading that the AWA was kind of the main territory that Vince pillaged.
Oh, yeah.
When he started to go national. And once again, that's about all I know.
Hogan, Okerlund, Heenan, the list goes on and on. The big, I think we'll probably hear stories about Heenan and Bockwinkel. And from what I understand, the Bobby Heenan and Nick Bockwinkel dynamic is very similar to what AEW was trying to do with the Don Callis and Kenny Omega dynamic.
Okay.
So, it'll be a fun episode for us to learn. We're going to be doing a bunch of learning next week as well. So
absolutely.
John, anything else?
No, just just the fact that I was a little worried about this episode, that because I did know a little bit about this, that how much of this is going to be stuff I've heard before. Well, I was not disappointed. I did plenty of learning on this one, just like the first one. So once again, these two, Evan and the two guys from Dark Side of the Ring,
Jason,
that's it. Yeah, are just putting together another killer show.
Yep, absolutely. So we will be back here next week to talk about the AWA show. Also, of course, our daily show comes out every morning, 5 to 10 minutes a day. You can learn the history of pro wrestling. John DeConnie this morning was one of your episodes. Bret Hart winning the WWF Championship for the first time at a house show.
House show in Saskatoon. Yeah, and hey, if you're short on time, this is one of the ones where I actually made it under that 10-minute mark. So, it's right there for you. It's very easily digestible and it's a lot of fun.
We should say that like it averages, because sometimes I come in under the 5-minute mark. So John will go over the 10 and I'll come under the 5. So, on average you're getting 7. So
Yeah.
all right. Well, we will see you next week, and you can hear us tomorrow.